Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you may be watching or listening to this. It is the Carving It Up U.S. Presidents Edition. We are on episode 3 now. We have covered the first 11 U.S. presidents from George Washington all the way to James K. Polk. And this episode today, in my view, certainly we're going to be covering Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and of course, Abraham Lincoln. Outside of Lincoln, and I just talked with our guest, Isaac Lawson, who's going to join us in just a second. We were talking a little bit before we started this. Like, outside of Lincoln, the characters themselves aren't overly colorful, not terribly interesting. Maybe you can make an argument for one, but you're going to see sort of a pattern of this is, in my view, the most important chapter in American history. Because you have guys that come into office, it's all about slavery. Like, slavery is the big issue dominating this era of presidents and of America. And more times than not, of course, as we all know, up until Lincoln, a president comes in, makes the issue worse, hands it off to another president who makes it even worse. And so this is going to be, without a question, a very interesting episode. And so, like I said, we're going to be covering the 12th president, Zachary Taylor, to the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. So we're going to be covering 5 presidents today. And so without further ado, let's get my man Isaac Lawson on the show. Isaac, can you hear me, man?
Yeah, thank you for having me on again.
Absolutely, man. I'm looking forward to doing this. So before we jump in, of course, we covered the last 2 episodes. What is kind of your, I guess, the narrative going into this 3rd episode? What do you want, I guess, the listeners and the viewers out there to take away from this episode before we get into it?
I would just say that, it's in a chapter in American history where basically America has a decision to make. Which path are they going to go down? And I think it really goes back to kind of the founding question, back to those liberties and the principles that were there that the founders kind of entrusted as part of our American heritage. And are we going to continue in that path or not? And I think that is kind of the question of the era. And we ultimately got that question, I would say, at the end of the Civil War, but we've still wrestled with it. But I think this is kind of the big decision point. And it's fiery, and we'll see a lot of that here.
You make a good point. This is really the turning point in American history. It's whether, okay, we're going to separate, of course, we'll get into this later on, but are we going to separate into, there's the United States, then there's the Confederate States. Does the experiment of democracy in the U.S. come to an end? I mean, this is, like I said, I think it's absolutely the most pivotal turning point in American history. And so here we go. We're going to start with Zachary Taylor, the 12th president of the United States. Here we go. Number 12, Zachary Taylor, Whig, 1849 to 1850, 64 years old, from Louisiana. So Zachary Taylor, we got another Whig coming into office. Of course, at this point, we still have the Whigs and we have the Democrats. Those are the 2 major political parties of the late 1840s and early 1850s. But with Zachary Taylor, you have a guy who, did not really seek out the office. I mean, he wasn't a guy who aspired to be president of the United States. I mean, he was a guy who, he was a general in the Mexican-American War. That's really his biggest claim to fame, certainly at this point. And both parties recruited him, and so he chooses the Whigs. Taylor was born on November the 24th of 1784 to Sarah and Richard Taylor. He married Margaret Smith in 1810. They had 6 children together. And, basically, he runs in 1848, obviously being a war hero, that automatically makes him pretty popular. But he appealed to the North as a war hero, and he appealed to the South as a slave owner. So kind of talk about Taylor's appeal to both sides and what ultimately won him that 1848 election.
I think one of the big factors for Taylor was kind of that his views kind of mesh right in the middle. He disagreed with some of Andrew Jackson's policies, like the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States, but he also didn't favor rechartering it. I think that's kind of a good example of an issue where he kind of appealed to both sides. So it's like Democrats, they would have really enjoyed him not wanting to, and really even what's the word I'm looking for? He would have appealed to them because he doesn't want to reestablish the bank. He kind of agrees with some of those general governing principles that were kind of set by Jackson and Polk. but at the same time, he is not in favor of that. What was kind of the popular Democratic policy then, and that's something that the Whigs are going to like. He's also somebody that's pretty personally popular. Like, people just kind of liked him. He was a war hero. We kind of fit with, like, not that there's a theme, but America does have a type for presidents,
Yeah.
and we like war heroes going back to Washington. And he fit that, and he was someone that people kind of viewed as dignified, but also at the same time, he had a little bit of common man appeal. So I think that that's kind of the best summary I could give for him for kind of his appeal to both sides. He was kind of split down the middle on a lot of issues, which has led to some historians and contemporaries to kind of accuse him of not really believing in anything, which I don't think is true. I just think that he was a centrist for the day. But I think that's where a lot of his appeal came from.
Yeah, it's probably true, and I think we see that many times with politicians. You'll have you have men and women who are, for the most part, right down the middle. Maybe they'll lean one way or another, but it doesn't necessarily mean. I think we get this confused oftentimes. It doesn't mean they don't believe in anything. It just believes, they think, okay, one side's got good ideas, and the other side has good ideas, and both have bad ideas as well. I think Taylor probably realized this. He was certainly somebody who, we kind of have. I guess you make the point about, sort of the common man style president, but we've had presidents in the past, and certainly you can argue maybe in recent years where, obviously the office and the man is dignified. Taylor was kind of a average looking, guy, 64-year-old guy. I mean, he wasn't a great public speaker. He would often appear dirty in public, and he didn't even vote in his own election, which I thought was a very interesting fact that I read when researching him. But, he kind of he was viewed as a Washington outsider, and, it's really not the truth. James Madison was his second cousin. Robert E. Lee was his fourth cousin once removed. And Jefferson Davis, who becomes a very important figure throughout this episode, he was once his son-in-law. And so once he becomes president, he kind of made it clear that he would defer to his cabinet. So very kind of the opposite of a John Tyler, for example, who was like, I'm the guy. I don't care if you are William Henry Harrison's cabinet. I make the decisions. Initially, Taylor's like, I'm going to defer to the cabinet. And so kind of show how that sort of changed while he was in office, because as his presidency, albeit short, passes along, he sort of evolves his views on, okay, hold on, I'm the chief executive. I'm the man in charge.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things there. His cabinet was interesting because he did two things when he was creating and making his choices for his different for who would hold the different offices there. One of those things was he did not pick any like big name Whigs, which was really controversial. He picked people that they weren't unknowns, but they weren't like the go-to people within the party. They weren't the it people. The second thing that he did was I'm so sorry, I lost my train of thought. The second thing that he did was he picked people from all different regions in the country. He had a really transactional cabinet in that way, being able to have people from kind of New England and the South and the Midwest, and those were kind of all the areas in the nation at that point. But by doing that, he was able to have a cabinet that kind of helped unify the country a little bit, which was something, because he saw some of the tensions as a Southerner that were rising in the South, and he hoped by kind of forcing kind of different sides of the country to all be together in his cabinet, and again, originally putting a lot of the decision making into the cabinet, would kind of help dissuade that. I would say, where we see him start to kind of trend away from the cabinet is one, there's some infighting there, not a ton, but they don't really like his vice president, Millard Fillmore, and he doesn't care that much, but that is something that bothers him a little bit, and he notices, and he doesn't like pettiness. He was someone, you mentioned about him like not voting in his own election. Taylor was a man with a lot of like personal principles. So that's something that kind of like applies there. He didn't really like that. And he also, the longer things went on, the more he kind of questioned some of the things they were doing and kind of settled more into the role of like, I'm president, if that makes sense. I'm the president, I make the decisions.
Yeah.
But he was someone like, I think the most interesting thing about him, you were talking about his kind of like plainness earlier. I think his plainness in a lot of ways is one of the most interesting things about him. Like when he went to Washington after being elected, he met with outgoing President Polk briefly. Polk was not impressed at all. Polk kind of thought he was an idiot. And that sounds like terrible, but he was like, this guy doesn't really know anything about politics. He doesn't really seem like he wants to know anything about politics. But at the same time, and that was kind of true, at the same time, though, what Taylor has going for him is that he recognizes a lot of the issues in the country. He understands them. So like he really hated the patronage system, which like that's something that we wouldn't see reform for that until like post Reconstruction. So like he's kind of ahead of like saying like this is bad. And you know, even though he was a slave owner, he did recognize the issue of slavery, and I would say has a greater awareness than the next couple presidents we're going to cover of kind of like where that's heading. And I think that he tries to like quietly set up some things to kind of like dissuade that, like I talked about with the cabinet. But you know, I think for a lot of his policy and his ideas and even his like governance style, I just don't think he had time to really flesh that out. And that's kind of the biggest thing with him.
Absolutely. And, you know, you mentioned how he is aware about the slavery debate. It's starting to get a little ugly right now. And so, you know, you see that some in the South at this point, some states are threatening to secede from the Union. So we're already sort of seeing this bubble up, at least. You know, it's a boiling pot right now in the southern states, as far as, you know, not wanting the government to interfere with the right that they believe they had to owning slaves. And so you see that there's an abolitionist movement in the North that's starting to gain more and more traction. And so what Henry Clay does is Senator Henry Clay, he organizes the Compromise of 1850, which would admit California as a free state with some pro-slavery measures for the South. And many thought Taylor would go along with this, but he surprised a lot of people by, you know, he believed that California shouldn't be admitted as a free state, and that there shouldn't be anything to compromise. So breaking his promise of saying, you know, okay, I'm going to defer to the cabinet, he threatened to veto the bill. And so he had his own very simplistic solution as to solving the issue. He threatened to hang the secessionists, starting with his former son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, who at this point was a senator from Mississippi. So, you know, he's kind of formulating this very simplistic, kind of brash solution, at least what he thought was. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about, and at least what James K. Polk, his predecessor, thought. Like, I don't think this guy really knows what he's doing. And so kind of talk about the Compromise of 1850 and why Taylor didn't go along with it, and sort of what happens, the aftermath of his threatened veto.
So the Compromise of 1850, like, kind of, I think the most important thing with it is just like the word compromise. Like, they're trying to find solutions to the slavery issue without directly addressing it. And one of those ways was through balance of power in Congress. Basically, there was this tight balance, especially in the Senate, between senators from slave states and senators from free states. And those senators almost always lined up with whether their state was free or slave state and their own personal views on slavery. And that was really important because basically when you kept it split, basically 50-50, no one side can pass legislation that will affect the entire nation on the issue. So as new states were being admitted to the Union in the Western territories, especially you think we're now post-Mexican-American War, so we have all the land ceded from Mexico, the kind of debate of what happens with that is there, and it's not really so much of do we eventually make it slave states or not. I'm sorry, it's not the debate about whether we make it states or not, but it's more of a question of if we are going to make them slave or free states and how that's going to affect that divide. And what most people's solution to it was basically just to say, we'll do 50-50, but no one could really agree on how they were going to do that. So 1850 was kind of, the Compromise of 1850 is basically trying to address that issue and to basically say, like, California will be a free state and we'll kind of give some secessions to the South to kind of make them, appease them for coming in as a free state. And Taylor basically kind of took a stand on it that people weren't expecting. It was kind of like, no, we're not going to do that. And it wasn't something that, even though the Whigs tended to be more abolitionists, not as much as their successor party.
Right.
But it was surprising that he took as strong of a stance that he did, because the Whigs were much more moderate and kind of trying to keep that balance. I think is a better way to kind of explain their views. They were abolitionists, but they wanted to keep the balance. And Taylor, I think, threw that off a little bit in a way that the party establishment wasn't expecting and the members of Congress weren't expecting. And I think in some ways that could have been a good thing, but at the same time, it clearly, I think he did have a little bit of a goal with that and an idea, but I think it shows from like a little bit of rashness and not really understanding the political system. And I also think that like our politicians at the time just weren't ready for it. I don't think they were prepared for that. He needed, and I guess this goes into him not really getting the political system, but he needed to like kind of prep them for it first, before he just kind of threw it out there.
And more than anything, Taylor he was not an abolitionist. We talked about, he was a slave owner in the South, but I'd say the best word to describe him, almost a little bit, of course they differed policy-wise, but a little bit Andrew Jackson-esque in that he wasn't an abolitionist, but he was a unionist above all. Like that was kind of where his views are certainly evolving at this point in time. So we get to 1850, we get to the 4th of July of 1850, and it's a hot, humid day. And Zachary Taylor goes to the groundbreaking ceremony for the Washington Monument. Of course, we all know what that is. And he's fatigued by the summer heat as he returns to the White House. And so he ate a bowl of cherries, and a cold bowl of cherries rather, and a pitcher of milk. And hours later, he complains of a terrible stomach aching. And 5 days later, on July the 9th of 1850, he died. He was 65 years old. And his final words were, quote, "I'm about to die. I expect the summons very soon. I've tried to discharge all my duties faithfully. I regret nothing, but I'm sorry that I'm about to leave my friends." And there's a lot of, we hear presidential conspiracy theories, many about, for example, John F. Kennedy, but there's a lot of conspiracy theories that continue to this day about how did Taylor die? Was it cholera? Was he poisoned? I mean, there's a lot of sort of debate as to what happened to him. And so kind of take us through the, I guess, involvement of what happens to Taylor and what is the most likely cause for his untimely death in 1850.
So the biggest thing was that it was just a very unexpected illness. It kind of came out of nowhere. He was older, but he had been in like relatively good health. So it wasn't like, it just kind of threw people off in the same way that, like, comparing it to the only other presidential death up to this point, which was William Henry Harrison. Harrison's death was rapid and he died very quickly, and it was really early in his administration. Taylor's been here for a little while. So it's different in that sense. Like, we've kind of gotten used to him being president, and it was just, and it was a little bit more of a drawn out illness, although it wasn't very long either. But it was longer than Harrison's. Yeah. And it's just unexpected. People weren't expecting this to happen. It's not something you really generally think about happening. Especially when we're only the second time it ever happening in American history. So we're still kind of unsure how to handle the whole thing. So as to possible causes, most people agree that it was some sort of like infection. We know it had something to do probably with his intestines. There were some reports of some of his cabinet members having similar illnesses that did not kill them, or at least similar symptoms around the same time. So it's possible that maybe it was an infectious disease or something that they were all eating. So people always note the cold cherries and the fresh milk. Potentially it could be something with that. People have cited possibly something with the milk. But we're not really sure. So they were able to rule out, I can't remember what year this was, but they actually
1991.
Thank you. They exhumed his body, and actually at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, they tested samplings from his fingernails and hair, and they found no evidence of poisons that they were able to test for. And they tested for ones that would be most likely for the time, and they were not able to find anything. So they believe that he most likely was not poisoned. The only other reason why is he wasn't. It would have been odd for him to have been poisoned. out of all the presidents, there wasn't like as much of a reason to. He didn't really have like, there were plenty of people that didn't like him, like whatever, as president, but there weren't any politicians that like, he had no enemies that hated him enough to go and kill him, as far as we knew.
Yeah, and that's kind of the mystery of it all. And like you made a good point. Of course, they did test his body. They convinced descendants of his to have them test his remains. They for the most part, they pretty much ruled out any signs of foul play. And so I didn't know about the infectious disease aspect. You know, maybe that's a possibility. Maybe it's the cherries. Maybe it's the milk. And so this is a question that's probably going to persist for a while now as to what happened to Zachary Taylor. But what we do know is his presidency lasted about a year and a half. And it possibly could have halted, or at the very least postponed, the coming of the Civil War, because he was pushing back on some of the Whig policies of the time, certainly the Compromise of 1850 being chief among them. And so now we have a man, his vice president, who takes over, a guy named Millard Fillmore, who is pretty much everything that Taylor was not. And similar to John Tyler, when he took over after the death of William Henry Harrison, he has some issues with Taylor's cabinet and really with the rest of the party. Number 13, Millard Fillmore, Whig, 1850 to 1853, 50 years old, from New York. So Millard Fillmore, he was born on January the 7th of 1800 to Phoebe Millard and Nathaniel Fillmore. He was the first president born in the 19th century. He married Abigail Powers in 1826, and they had 2 children together. And again, unlike Taylor, he loved to read, and he was a likable character. He kind of carried himself very unlike his predecessor. He was always very well dressed. As a matter of fact, Queen Victoria called him the most handsome man she had ever met. And so, you know, he was very distinguished, very put together. But it was something I didn't know until I looked this up. Millard Fillmore and Zachary Taylor had never even met until after they were elected. And so it kind of goes to show you, Taylor's just like, okay, this is just a balanced ticket. I don't really know this guy. I don't really, I'm not sure if we even align that much, but hey, if it balances the ticket, if it wins me the election, it's all good. And so kind of talk about his personality and how he was received around Washington. You mentioned earlier that the Whigs weren't huge fans of Millard Fillmore as a whole.
So I would say, like, for his personal life story, it's actually kind of interesting. He actually grew up in poverty, and it was very much like a self-made man. Like, he, you know, worked, he made money, he went to college. Like, he did that on his own and, like, rose out of poverty to become, even though it was through a death, president of the United States. So I think in that way, he has a very, like, American story just for him personally. But honestly, personality-wise, he was just boring. There's not really, like, a lot of, even from what I've been able to find, not even a lot of, like, contemporary, like, reports of what he was like, which is interesting. There are a lot of comments about him being handsome. Queen Elizabeth was not the only person at the time that thought that about him. But he wasn't really well liked by the Whigs. And to some extent, I've kind of had trouble finding why. I know that some of the cabinet members didn't like him because they felt like he viewed himself as kind of a leader of the cabinet, and they didn't like that when he was vice president. And then afterwards, and when we get into his presidency, there was an expectation that still exists today, generally, that if an incumbent president dies or resigns, that all of their cabinet members will go to the president and basically turn in a letter of resignation, and then that president will choose whether to keep them or not, and will normally retain them until they are able to make their own appointments. And some different presidents have kept different amounts of their former president's cabinet members. So when that happens for Fillmore, this is kind of the first time that that's really happened, but that's kind of what people kind of accept, like that's what the expectation is. And when the cabinet members go to do that, they've all kind of wronged him because they don't like him, and he knows they don't like him. And he tells them all, like, okay, resign. And they're like expecting to be him to basically be like, oh, I need you for my administration, for the cabinet. We have to do all these things and be like the first great Whig presidency. And they're all very disappointed when Fillmore's like, bye, good riddance. So then that happens, and then he's like, oh, could you guys just stay for a month until I can get people in there? And they're all like, no.
Yeah.
And that causes some of the his problems with the party. Is kind of, he has this disagreement with Taylor's cabinet, and then when he gets in there, he kind of like shoves it right back at them, and then that kind of just makes the whole situation worse for everybody. He did have his own cabinet. It wasn't as regionally balanced as Taylor's was. He brings in some more like bigger names from the Whig Party, but it's not really anything like super duper notable. But he does get through that. But that's kind of like an early kind of like mini crisis in his presidency, and it gives him like a little bit of a rough start. But he continues with a lot of the traditions that John Tyler set with for dealing with the death of a president. You know, very respectful. They go through like a long mourning period. And he kind of, by continuing Taylor's precedent there, he kind of sets those things in stone. And that's the same way that it has been ever since then when a president dies. So.
Yeah, and to a certain degree, you can at least, even if certainly John Tyler's presidency was an abject failure, and we'll see the same can be said about Millard Fillmore's presidency, at the very least, to their credit, they set a precedent. They set a sort of tradition that has been continued to this very day, and is continued throughout American history, throughout the death of other presidents. And so I think at the very least, they do deserve some credit in that regard, as you bring up. But sort of opposite of Zachary Taylor's views, Millard Fillmore signs the Compromise of 1850 into law. Mm-hmm. And this is pretty much because Fillmore supported slavery, because he thought it was it would lead to the Southern economy's collapse should it be removed. And he thought that it was supported by the Constitution. And this is, I think we may have mentioned this in the previous episode, Isaac, that sort of this pro-slavery movement kind of originated from, well, hey, the founding fathers, totally back this. And so if they said it, then it's the gospel. And so it's kind of this infighting between, you've got the pro-slavery and then the abolitionists that are clashing constantly. And we'll see that, throughout this episode. But, kind of that fighting going back and forth. And really all Millard Fillmore does is inflame it. I mean, he only makes it worse with signing this compromise. And, what he thought he would put the issue to bed forever by signing this compromise, as Henry Clay and the other Whigs had intended, but he failed to realize the moral implications of it, and that's of course what we see throughout the history of slavery in America. Is you don't take into account that, hey, these are people that are being oppressed daily by these slave owners, and so he thought it would please both sides, but kind of talk about how it really just made the issue worse.
I think probably the best example of like the biggest problem with the Compromise of 1850 comes in the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act is probably the most like notorious and infamous part of the Compromise of 1850, and there were other problems with it, but this one will continue to be important as we lead up to the Civil War. But basically what it did was it required that all escaped slaves, even if they were in northern free states, and regardless of how long they had been escaped for and had been free for, were still considered to be property of their masters and were required to be returned to their masters, regardless of what state or jurisdiction they were in. So this would lead to several problems. One is you would have people who had run away and were living in, say, Pennsylvania now, and their old slave master would send someone up to Pennsylvania from, say, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and then would basically go hunt them down and forcibly bring them back, and no one could stop them from doing this. Another issue with it, and this one there are several examples of, where basically these, like, they were called like slave hunters, would go up into northern states and would kidnap freed black people and would just bring them to the South and claim them as their slaves and say that they had run away. And because there wasn't a lot of documentation of that sort of thing, they couldn't really prove it. So long as they, if a slave hunter did that, as long as they could get their buddy to come and say, "Oh yeah, these are his slaves," the freed black people that he had kidnapped, their testimony was not allowed in court, so they couldn't even go up and defend themselves. So those are two of the biggest issues with the Fugitive Slave Act, and why that law just kind of inflamed things even further. Especially in the North with the abolitionist movement, it outraged them. So signing the Compromise of 1850, even though it gave the North and the abolitionists a win in admitting California as a free state, it really hurt the abolitionist cause, and just inflamed tensions even more. But that time on the northern side of it, not on the southern side.
Yeah, and it goes to show you sort of the evils that came out of it, and it's one of the worst bits of legislation that's ever been signed, certainly in this period, certainly in the 19th century of presidents. And you have this tumultuous sort of 2.5-year period where Fillmore's president, and he's disagreeing with the Whigs, and obviously the Democrats, of course, they don't want anything to do with him. So the election of 1852 comes around. The Whigs don't even renominate him. So he leaves office, and his wife and his daughter both pass away within the first year of his retirement. And so he marries a woman named Caroline McIntosh, who he remained with for the rest of his life. And Millard Fillmore died on March the 8th of 1874. And he was 74 years old. His final words were allegedly, again, this has not been confirmed, but, quote, the nourishment is palpable, while he was being fed a bowl of soup on his deathbed. So
I do think it's notable to say about him, because he did live into the Civil War.
Yes.
He stayed aligned with the Union. He openly criticized the secession and supported the war effort. He did criticize several of Lincoln's policies during the war and questioned Lincoln's leadership, but his commitment to the Union never faded. And that is just something that I would note about him.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair to note. And a lot of some of the former presidents, once they leave office and once Lincoln does, take over as president in 1861, many do criticize his. I mean, Lincoln was not a popular figure,
No,
and of course
no.
we'll get into this later. But he was sort of in a different way of Andrew Jackson, but sort of in the same breath that you either loved Lincoln or you hated his guts. And so, and some of the former presidents, maybe they didn't hate him, but they certainly hated some of his policies. But Fillmore, like you mentioned, was one of these. At the very least, he did stay committed to the Union. And so Fillmore kind of dedicates. There was sort of what I meant to say is there was a sort of Millard Fillmore Society. I remember reading about this, that would come to his gravesite every year on the anniversary of his death to sort of kind of remember what is really one of the most forgotten presidencies in American history. I think some have compared him to Gerald Ford in a certain way, just kind of not much happened.
I can't remember the name of this organization that did this study, but there was a study, I believe in 2015, that ranked him as the least remembered president. They basically asked people to name all the presidents they could think of, and he was the one that the most people could not remember.
There you go. I mean, it's a forgettable presidency, and it's a forgettable 2.5 years when he takes over after the passing of Zachary Taylor. And so now we get to 1852, 1853, and we have, in the same way, different policies, I think, possibly, but in the same way, a sort of dark horse candidate emerges, a man from New Hampshire by the name of Franklin Pierce, who becomes the nation's 14th president. Number 14, Franklin Pierce, Democrat, 1853 to 1857, 48 years old, from New Hampshire. So Franklin Pierce, as you heard, 48 years old. He was at the time the youngest elected president in American history at this point, our nation's 14th president. He was born on November the 23rd, 1804, to Benjamin Pierce, who actually fought in the Revolutionary War. And you know what his mother's name was? Anna Kendrick. Just to throw that out there. Not that Anna Kendrick, obviously, but just thought that was a very interesting fact. He married Jane Appleton in 1834, and they had 3 children together. Tragically, all 3 children died in youth, and this becomes very significant later on after he wins. And so he's elected in 1852 because he's got strong ties to the North. Of course, he's from New Hampshire. New Hampshire's only president. He's a Northern Democrat. He has strong ties to the South. He was very much pro-slavery. And he was probably the most well-liked man in politics. Like at this time, no one really disliked Franklin Pierce. Everybody kind of liked him, right? He's young. He's an attractive guy. And so he was kind of the guy, like, you know, it's kind of the classic, like, if you don't like them, it's a you problem. And another reason he was well liked at this time, alcohol is becoming very much a big part of politics. And Franklin Pierce, to put it mildly, was himself an alcoholic. He dealt with issues with it really most of his life, except for actually his presidency. He didn't seem, by all accounts, to have any issues with it during his 4 years in office. But he was, you know, like I said, he's a dark horse candidate. His wife, I read she fainted when she heard that he had won the nomination, because the Democrats, like, who do we find? We're not real sure what we do here. So kind of talk about his election. So, I mean, he was called a handsome Frank, even kind of his appeal to both sides as that candidate.
So he was someone. So the Democratic Party at the time was in a little bit of disarray. They had lost another election to the Whigs. James K. Polk hadn't run for re-election, and they were struggling to find a clear leader of their party. So when they go into their convention and they're trying to choose who is going to lead, they have a number of different candidates, but each one for different reasons. Either one section of the party won't get behind them, or they're worried that they won't be able to win the general election, or they can't get in line with the party's platform in some important way, and they're trying to kind of find someone who can be a leader for the party, and can also lead them to victory at the same time. So as they're going through, basically Pierce's name just kind of gets thrown in there. And as they're going through, Pierce just starts to check all their boxes. He's young. He has a lot of energy behind him. He is not in the same way as like a Teddy Roosevelt energetic, but he's someone who he just has that youthfulness to him.
Yep.
And he was handsome. He was popular within Vermont. He was in favor of slavery, but he was from the North, and he understood the abolitionist sentiment of the North. So he had a little bit of dual appeal there, because he understood both sides. So you have all of that, and they kind of come together into this candidate that the Democratic Party basically looked at and said, he's someone that, you know, will promote our agenda, can appeal to the northern states that don't like us as much, and has energy. And those are 3 things that they really kind of drew him into the forefront in that nominating process. And the way that he won was basically, as they kind of checked people's names off the list, his name just kind of stayed on the list, because, like you said, people generally liked him. Nobody really had any problems with Franklin Pierce, at least before the election. And that really helped him out. He was non-controversial.
Yeah, and he, like you mentioned, I forgot to bring at this point. You brought it up. He was very much an energetic guy, like you said, had that sort of youthful spirit, and so he's got the ties to the South, and that he's pro-slavery, as you mentioned. He's from the North. He's from New Hampshire. He understands, at the very least, the abolitionist movement. I guess unlike Millard Fillmore, his predecessor, and so he wins in 1852, and similar to Andrew Jackson, the joy of victory is very, very short-lived, because on January the 6th of 1853, Franklin, his wife Jane, their only surviving son Benny, they're in a train, and for whatever reason, no one's quite sure why, the train it falls into an embankment. And by all accounts, there were no serious injuries. People, of course, got injured. They fell off a train, but there were injuries. But there were no fatalities, except for one. The president's the president-elect's 11-year-old son, Benjamin Pierce, was decapitated, and so it's devastating for a man like Franklin Pierce. Apparently, he he saw what had happened. He threw his coat over Benny, hoping his wife Jane did not see it. She, of course, did. And so it's just this deep depression, this deep melancholy for the two. And it really just casts a very dark cloud over the Pierces and over the White House for all 4 years. And so kind of talk about that event and just the devastation for the two of them.
So Jane Pierce had struggled with depression after the death of their first two sons. So this third death of their final son, and she really, really loved Benjamin Pierce. She was just completely crushed. She sunk into a deep depression that, from the accounts at the time, never left her. She struggled with that for the rest of her life, and never really recovered from this death. During their time in the White House, it would be lacking in kind of the events and kind of like wine and dine sort of thing that was common for the First Lady to kind of lead to help the president kind of make those connections, because she just wasn't there. There are a lot of accounts of her just sitting in dark rooms and rarely talking to people. And some people would call her the ghost of the White House, because she would be in light so little that her skin was like extremely pale. Franklin Pierce also became extremely depressed. It was a really traumatic incident because, as you said, Benjamin Pierce was decapitated in front of them. He was 11 at the time. And Franklin Pierce, I think that this is, even though it's just before his presidency, I think this is the defining moment of his time in office. That this set that shadow over all of it, and he was not able to recover from this depression. And he, I think that it's fair to say, because of this, he was not an effective leader. And I don't think that he was able to be an effective leader.
And that's the number one thing that I've heard many historians talk about, is because of this. He wasn't necessarily a guy who had like a ton of backbone to begin with. And so this happening, just obviously weakened that. Many describe him as a weak leader in office. Like you mentioned, talking about Jane, she did not appear publicly at the White House until a full 2 years into her husband's administration. And so it really caused the two to be mentally unstable. It was just such a tragic event. And things did not get better once Franklin took office, because only 6 weeks into his presidency, his vice president, named William Rufus King, he dies in office. So now you have the vice presidency, which, by the way, is vacant throughout the rest of the Pierce administration. And so you had the president's son is killed. You have the vice president dies in office. And so it only gets worse. 1854 comes around, and Senator Stephen Douglas comes to Pierce with this with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And basically what this is going to do is it's designed to repeal the Missouri Compromise of James Monroe's administration, and sort of it would ban slavery in states above the southern border of Missouri. And sort of the intent of the bill was to let the new territories above the border, Kansas and Nebraska, decide for themselves whether they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. And so Douglas puts a ton of pressure on Pierce. He promised to make his presidency a living nightmare if Pierce did not go along with the bill. And so talk about how Pierce completely caves into this, and just the horrible ramifications of this awful piece of legislation.
I would basically say Pierce was already in a living nightmare, and he didn't really want anything else added to that. I'd say he cared and wanted to do a good job as president, but I would say, as a result of the Depression, it wasn't the forefront of his thoughts. I think he recognized that he was in a depressed state. He recognized that he was struggling just with the power and the position that he was in, and he just didn't want to put up the fight. And I think he honestly wasn't sure if he could put up the fight against Douglas. And with the position that he was in, I hate to say, but the easiest thing for him to do was just to give in to Douglas's wishes, and he did. I think you want to fault him for not fighting against it, because Pierce, when he entered office, and this is notable, had publicly stated, and in his inaugural address, stated that he was not in favor of the expansion of slavery, although he didn't say it in those words. He avoided using the word slavery in his addresses. He said the expansion of evils. Um, but by signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and backing it, he was opening that door for slavery to expand into the West in a way that previously had been agreed would not happen.
And he breaks really I would say three major events happen because of this. So obviously, like you mentioned, he goes against a promise of his at his inaugural address, and something that he kind of campaigned on. You have that. You have the fact that slavery kind of does expand in a way, and you have the fact that pro and anti-slavery settlers are literally fighting it out. And at one point, when was it? I'm trying to remember. May 21st of 1856. The city of Lawrence, Kansas is burned to the ground. I mean, it is literally just, they called it Bleeding Kansas, as a matter of fact. It was sort of a mini civil war of sorts. And so what is interesting, and certainly I would say arguably the most significant part about this, is the Kansas-Nebraska Act unintentionally leads to the rise of a little-known, not very popular Whig politician, a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. He was absolutely outraged at this Kansas-Nebraska Act, and so he helps form the Republican Party that we know today. So, really, I would say long-term, the biggest ramifications of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is it really kind of started the Republican Party. And so Lincoln forms this. And so despite all the chaos around the country, despite the fire, literally, Pierce, for whatever reason, thinks that he can win a second term. But the Democrats are like, no, this has been an absolute disaster for 4 years. We don't want anything to do with you. And so he goes back home to New Hampshire. He's not received horribly well by the country. It's crazy. He goes from being the most liked man in the country to probably the most hated. And so his wife Jane dies, and he goes again. He goes once back. He turns once again back to alcohol. He spends the rest of his life kind of as a recluse. And so he dies on October the 8th of 1869. His final words are unknown. He was 64 years old, and the alcohol is what caused his death. He died of cirrhosis of the liver. And so talk about sort of his, I guess, post-presidency and how his legacy, certainly even to this day, is not very popular.
So unlike what we're going to see with Buchanan, who we'll get to next, and what we saw with Fillmore, both of them will remain active in politics after their time in office. Fillmore more than Buchanan. And we see them kind of be vocal about the Civil War and Reconstruction. That doesn't happen with Franklin Pierce. He is done with politics after this, mostly because his personal issues are just too overwhelming. He obviously is not a vocal supporter of the Confederacy or anything like that. He was most likely a Unionist. It would have been unlikely that he would have supported the Confederacy. He just didn't vocalize anything about the Civil War, really. He remained kind of outside of the debates of that era. I think, honestly, the best word to describe his post-presidency is just sad. He's someone, disagree with his policies as one may. His whole legacy is just depressing. It's just sad. You can't help but kind of feel for the guy. But even if his personal problems were the reason for his very lackluster presidency, I think it's hard to, and this is probably a poor choice of words, describe it as anything other but a train wreck. It was a hot mess. And that's really kind of like the best way I feel like to describe Pierce. There's a lot of possibility and opportunity, and it kind of just all goes down the drain before it really starts.
And you make a compelling point, like kind of the death of his son and how his son died is really a perfect representation of his life and of his presidency. And so it's tragic. It's a mess. It's, sort of, he's not a guy with a ton of backbone to begin with. Of course, the events of his life only make this worse. And so, Franklin Pierce is a guy who on most lists is often ranked in one of the bottom 5 presidents because his policies hasten the coming of the Civil War. And as we're about to see with his successor, he only made it worse.
Number 15, James Buchanan, Democrat, 1857 to 1861, 65 years old, from Pennsylvania.
James Buchanan, he was born on April the 23rd of 1794 to Elizabeth Spear and James Buchanan Sr. I would say probably the most well-known fact about James Buchanan is that to this point, he is the only president in history to never marry. And he had a relationship with a woman. I forgot what her name was, but she died of an illness. And it kind of, I guess, sort of, messed him up as far as getting into any more serious relationships. But there are, to this day, sort of the persisting rumors that he very well could have been gay. And so talk about sort of the where that started. I mean, even people sort of suspected this back when he was a Pennsylvania politician, and how it's sort of persisted to this day.
So he was a longtime roommate with was actually Pierce's vice president, who
William Rufus King.
Live in that office for very long. King and Buchanan were longtime roommates. Both of them had failed relationships with women, and there were just a lot of rumors about their relationship. We don't have any hard evidence, but we have a lot of speculation at the time, and a lot of speculation afterwards. We know that they were really fond of each other. They were at least really close friends. And there's some speculation about some of the language that they used about each other, but it's not really clear personally. But at the time, there was definitely speculation, or at least some mockery about it. It's actually, I believe it was Andrew Jackson was the one that coined the names for them as Miss Fancy and Miss Nancy, kind of mocking them as being feminine and possibly a couple. But it's kind of unclear how much of that was just kind of partisan teasing and mockery, and how much of that might have been serious. I feel like for the time and the culture around that issue, I feel like it would have been difficult for someone who was in a homosexual relationship to make it as high in government and public office as the two of them did. But it's not impossible. And it's just one of those questions that's kind of going to be lost to the ages. We don't really know.
And it's, as I heard one historian pointed out, it's kind of hard to make an assumption of someone. Obviously, we live in a social media culture, but it's tough to really even make that assumption about someone today, let alone the 1850s. And so that in itself is sort of a mystery amongst in and of itself. Excuse me. But he was him being a bachelor and coming in office actually led to the title First Lady. Because his niece, Harriet Lane, served as what was initially called basically the White House hostess, is kind of the unofficial term to describe it. And she was described as the First Lady. Of course, as we all know, that has continued to this day.
And part of that was because most of the time they would refer to what we would now call the First Lady as either just the president's wife, the White House hostess, or they would actually refer to them as Madam President. And those went out of style because they felt like Madam President and obviously the wife of the president were not appropriate for someone who was the president's niece. And there had been other first ladies at that point in time who were not the wife of presidents, because there had been some who would come in and were widowers.
Thomas Jefferson, for example.
But at that point in time, it would have been more likely that they just would have been called the White House hostess. The kind of name surrounding it kind of developed as time went on.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Buchanan comes in office, and even to this day, he's one of the most accomplished and qualified people to be president, because he had been a representative, a foreign minister under Andrew Jackson. He'd been a senator, and he had been the Secretary of State under President Polk. And so he was a guy who, hey, he's got the qualifications. Nobody's worrying about his experience or lack thereof. And so right off the bat, he endorsed the Constitution written by the pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, and the decision was criticized by not just Northern Republicans, but by Northern Democrats as well, because it basically appeared that Buchanan was trying to force slavery into a sort of area where no one really wanted it. So, I mean, right off the bat, he's already further inflaming the slavery issue, making it worse and worse and worse. And he kind of, in a way, and this is what led to his demise, at least as far as his popularity, as far as he sort of alienates those who voted for him and say, hey, you've got some, you're trying to fix the slavery issue, but all of your policies seem to be pro-slavery. And so talk about that and talk about just his failures in office in that regard.
Buchanan didn't really want to have to pick a side in the slavery debate because he thought that picking a side would spur on civil war, which possibly was true. The problem with that, though, was by not picking a side, he just made everybody angry. The South felt like he was not doing enough to kind of defend what they viewed as their right, and they viewed him as kind of a do-nothing president, and the North viewed him as someone who was at least a closet slave sympathizer. He was at least quietly kind of siding with the South, and that wasn't necessarily reflective of his views, because even then he tried to keep them kind of vague, but at least like his cabinet was overwhelmingly pro-slavery, and so were a lot of his friends and the kind of Democratic Party bigwigs that he was often around. So it could be fair to say that he might have been influenced by them, but kind of either way, he really didn't help anybody out. The decisions that he made tended to either kind of not really do anything, or like the situation with recognizing the slave holding government of the slave. Well, I'm so sorry. The slave state.
No, don't worry about it.
Government of Kansas as being the legitimate government of Kansas was extremely controversial, especially because that election was probably fraudulent from what we were able to tell, because they didn't really supervise who was coming in to vote, and it looked like a lot of Texans were coming into Kansas, and a lot of as well as people from Missouri and Arkansas, and were voting in the election to try to sway it to make it a slave state, because especially since without like the records we have today, it's a lot harder to be able to tell who's going, a lot harder to like, are you from here or not, because it was kind of this wide open territory and there were a ton of people there, and they were all spread out. So when people were coming in to vote, you didn't really know. And most historians would agree that election was fraudulent. Right. But he recognized that government as legitimate, and that was probably one of the most inflaming things that he did, because it just made the North incredibly angry, because he was basically awarding the South 2 new senators to help be proponents of slavery, even though they, under the Compromise of 1850, would not have been allowed to get those, would not have allowed Kansas to be a slave state. And, the election was fraudulent, and it was tipping the balance in the Senate towards slavery. And you just kind of had this combination of things. And that's just a good example, but a combination of things that are kind of just making the North more and more angry. And at the same time, kind of like I already said, that the South kind of feels like he's not really doing anything to directly help them. And it's just kind of frustrating everyone. And that's kind of the biggest problem with him.
Right. And Buchanan was a candidate who, and this was typical for some candidates at that time, he did not run for re-election. I'm not real sure he would have won to begin with. But his, like you said, the backing of what was going on in Kansas, this sort of flip-flop, not really holding any strong opinions, is really the biggest mark on him, and what many people, like you mentioned on both sides, the pro and anti-slavery people in the country were starting to recognize about him. And so what happens, and by the way, one more point, you mentioned his cabinet was very much pro-slavery. It really goes back to sort of the old cliche saying, like, you can tell me a lot about a man or an individual in general by the people they surround themselves with.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe Buchanan isn't directly saying I'm pro or against slavery, but again, as they say, actions speak louder than words. But what were you going to say?
Well, like even with an example of that, his vice president, John C. Breckinridge, served in the Confederate government. I would have to double check this, but I believe he even served in Jefferson Davis's cabinet.
Dang, wow. Okay, so,
but I'll double check that. But he, it was one of those things where even though Buchanan himself remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, he just didn't help anything. I think with him, just some other things about his presidency just quickly are notable. You have an economic collapse in the second half of it. I believe it's in the second half. You also have some armed conflict with Mormon settlers in Utah. And both of those things are wildly unpopular. It's sometimes referred to as the Utah War. That was not popular. People didn't like it. They felt like it was unnecessary. And that goes into some other problems that were going on in Utah territory that eventually ended when Utah was admitted as a state to the Union. And then with the economic collapse, the South was not significantly hurt by it, but the North was really struggling. And he didn't really put forward any kind of plan or even make any kind of concessions to the North to kind of try to alleviate that. He didn't really help them out with trade or anything like that could kind of help alleviate those economic woes. And as he was kind of giving the South some boosts with slavery, that made him even more unpopular in the North, because it was kind of like bad times and you're making this great evil worse. That led him to be very, very unpopular there. And I did double check real quick. John C. Breckinridge was the Confederate Secretary of War.
There you go. And so that's a very interesting fact. I did not know that. And so, like you said, I mean, we brought up in the previous episode, John Tyler, before his passing, was elected. I forgot. I think he was a representative in those Confederate states. So, speaking of those Confederate states, they don't become that quite yet, at least until the election of 1860, one of the most pivotal, probably the most pivotal election in American history. We hear these debates every year. We see the primaries, the Democrats, Republicans are like, this is the most consequential. Baloney. 1860 was the most consequential, or at least certainly one of the most. You've got Stephen Douglas. We mentioned him and his pushing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act with Franklin Pierce. And then the other side, you have a guy who he beat in Illinois in 1858 on the Republican side, Abraham Lincoln. And so Lincoln wins, and this is really the last straw for the pro-slavery people in the country, certainly obviously in the South, because they're basically about to lose their ally in the White House for the first time in a while. And so on December the 20th of 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Buchanan tried to pass a series of constitutional amendments that protected slavery, but as a lame duck president, the radical states were not going to listen to him. And as it passes, 6 more states secede, and 8 more states become border states. They're not sure what direction they're going to go as far as staying with the Union or seceding from it. And so this is the country kind of collapses the last weeks of James Buchanan's presidencies. And so, and by the way, on February the 9th of 1861, the Confederate States of America elected Jefferson Davis as its first president. And so talk about the just utter collapse as far as the seceding states, starting with South Carolina. And just, I mean, we know how important this was, but sort of give the viewers and listeners a real perspective about how horrible this was.
So when Lincoln is elected, even though during the election, he publicly was saying that he was not going to outlaw slavery, he was just against the expansion of slavery,
right.
Which we'll get into that a little bit later, and Lincoln's actual views on slavery. But he said those things, but to Southerners, it didn't really matter. The Republican Party was founded as an abolitionist party. They were pushing, at least for the end of expansion of slavery, and that was kind of the writing on the wall for them. When he wins, and he narrowly wins, they basically just kind of throw their hands up and say, we're done then. We're going over here and we're going to do our own thing. You guys can leave us be. South Carolina leads this effort, being the first state to secede. They've already had some kind of secessionist movements on their own, going back to when probably the first notable one was when Andrew Jackson was in office, which we talked about in a previous episode. The other states kind of go one by one. So you have like different situations with each one. In Tennessee and Virginia, there are notable anti-secession efforts. Both of those states have notable efforts to remain in the Union. But other states don't have that. Again, South Carolina is a good example. Honestly, North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi are all good examples of states that don't really have a lot of controversy within the state about secession. The South fires the first shots at Fort Sumter, and it all just kind of blows up from there. Buchanan is notable in this because these states are starting to secede while he is still in office, and he is a lame duck. And you discuss some of his efforts there. He's been criticized mostly by historians for not really putting too much effort into trying to quell this rebellion as it's starting. And at the time, he probably would have said that was because, he was an outgoing president. Lincoln was the one coming in to office. But in a lot of ways, it looks like an admission of failure. It appears that he's recognizing that he has failed and has kind of given up. Which, with how bad his presidency was, maybe is fair. But it just kind of adds on at the end that he comes in, with someone who is extremely well prepared for the office, at least on paper, and leaves as arguably one of the worst American presidents ever. And kind of for what he views as attempts to kind of like ease the divisions around slavery, kind of just results in things getting so much worse. But I guess the one maybe good thing you could take out of it, and this is really kind of looking for an upside to what is a terrible situation, is at least now the country is going to have to actually deal with this issue. And I guess you could thank Buchanan for that, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily a thanks.
Yeah, I don't think you can necessarily thank Buchanan for that. Like we've talked about throughout this episode so far, and we're of course about to get in Abraham Lincoln, but just and we talked about this before, we got into Zachary Taylor, like the president hands off to president, he makes the situation worse, he hands it off to successor, he makes it worse. So it wasn't all James Buchanan's fault, of course. He came into a bad situation, but he made it worse. Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, he sort of almost like the South in a way after Lincoln's election victory, he sort of throws his hands up and he's saying, oh, well, I guess that's it. And, on most lists, of course, later down the road in our final episode of the series, we're going to rank our list. But in most, if not, I wouldn't say all is a strong word, but in most, on most presidential rankings list, James Buchanan is ranked last. And this, I think they have a pretty good reason to do this. So his last day in office, inauguration day, Lincoln's inauguration, he told Abraham Lincoln, quote, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland," which was where he's from, Pennsylvania, "you are a happy man." And so Buchanan is just relieved to get out of there and sort of hand this to Lincoln and say, good luck. And so he died on June the 1st of 1869. He was 77 years old. And his final words were, quote, "O Lord Almighty, as thou wilt." So he sort of, and like you mentioned, he was vocal during the Civil War. He was vocal in politics. And so, but like we talked about, his presidency was, to say it in the nicest terms possible, an abject failure. I mean, it was an absolute positive disaster. And so we're in a situation now in America where the last, and I guess you can kind of give Taylor somewhat of a pass, as you brought up earlier, because he did die in office a year and a half in, but the last three presidents are just making the problem worse and worse and worse, to the point where, yes, as you mentioned, we're addressing it, but we're going to war with ourselves. It's gotten so bad. And so now it's time. The man who everybody knows man who's on the $5 bill in your pocket, the man who has a monument in Washington, D.C., and a complex individual, to say the very least, Abraham Lincoln.
Number 16, Abraham Lincoln, Republican, 1861 to 1865, 52 years old, from Illinois.
Abraham Lincoln, somebody who honestly kind of transcended the presidency. I mean, he's really, I mean, if we talk about iconic Americans, he's really at the top of the list. I mean, at least near the top when we think about not just presidents, but, you know, civil rights leaders and celebrities and things of that nature. And so he's born on February the 12th of 1809 to Nancy Hanks and Thomas Lincoln, and he married Mary Todd in 1842. They had 4 children together. Quick story before we get into this. I don't know if I told you this before, but we actually, my family and I, about 4 years ago, we went to Lexington, Kentucky, and we went to the Mary Todd Lincoln house. Have you ever been there?
I have not. Okay,
I would highly suggest to you and everybody out there to go visit this, certainly if you live in an area at least somewhat near Lexington. So we got to see the house. We got to see like where she lived and things of that nature. It's sort of been preserved into a, you know, of course, a historical sort of a place. But the guy who led us on the tour, it was very weird. He said they walked there. There was a music box like in kind of the living room near the fireplace. They got like a music box that she owned, and they said overnight, you know, that they leave, they close the place up, and they come back, and the music box is playing. So it's like, oh boy, she coming to haunt us. So just want to throw that.
Well, you know, they do say that Abraham Lincoln's ghost haunts the White House as well. So maybe it runs in the family.
Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Lincoln was the tallest man to ever be president at 6 feet 4 inches tall. And he appeared even taller when he wore his trademark hat, as we see in many pictures of him. But speaking of pictures, he loved to be photographed. And he was, some would say he would probably be a big fan of Instagram, because like I said, he was someone who enjoyed being photographed throughout his life, and especially during his presidency. So he also had an excellent sense of humor, and he would sort of use it as a weapon against his enemies, sort of the self-deprecation. As a matter of fact, one time I can't remember. I think this might have been during the 1860 election, if I'm not mistaken. He was called two-faced, you know, basically saying he was flip-floppy. And he said, if I was two-faced, what you think I'd be wearing this one? I mean, he wasn't exactly the most attractive human being in the world. And so he sort of used that as a means of self-deprecation. So he's very smart. He was not college educated at all, but sort of talk about Lincoln's, you know, his rise in politics, his rise as far as getting the very best education he could for his means. Of course, everybody knows he's born in a log cabin. He's you know, grows up in poverty, and sort of his rise to being president of the United States.
You know, I think Lincoln was someone who really valued education and really sought it out throughout his life. There's a lot of accounts of him as a child, kind of reading anything he could get his hands on, and going out and really seeking out books and seeking out an education as a child. And that continued later in life. You know, he loved to read. He eventually went on to become a lawyer. You know, he did kind of career jump when he was younger. He served in the military briefly. He was a lawyer. He jumped around a little bit there. He was someone that I would kind of describe him that did seek, especially again going back in his youth, kind of a greater purpose to his life, and one that I would say that he ultimately did find during his time in politics and especially as president. You know, I think going into Lincoln and discussing Lincoln and especially his presidency, I think the best way to summarize it is difficult, weary, but I think that as both of those things are accurate descriptions of it, I think it's also one with a lot of purpose and
Right.
with mission, and one that I think rightfully so is considered one of the greatest in American history.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I might give kind of my abbreviated description of my
Sure.
abbreviated overview of his presidency. You know, he comes in, the war has started. He is very tactical, especially with Fort Sumter. Basically, we're kind of waiting to see who's going to fire the first shot, and the South wants the North to fire the first shot in the war. But he basically sends this ship to deliver supplies to Fort Sumter, and he basically says to the Confederates, this is just like food and blankets. Like, we have no weapons on here. We have no like men coming over to help like fortify. That's all that's on here. So just like, as a humanitarian thing, just let it pass. And he wasn't lying. It was true. That's all that was on the ship. But he knew this would happen. That's what he was betting on. The Confederates don't buy it, and they fire first.
Yep.
And he is able to use that, and it was a strategic victory for him, to use that to kind of become a rallying cry for the beginning of the war. Because, he sees the writing on the wall here. He knows it's not going to be avoided, but he's able to use that and kind of use that as this moral imagery of, we didn't start this, but we're going to finish it, and that we are going to preserve this union, and we are going to preserve the ideals of our founders. And he would define those ideals, not including slavery. He, especially as the war went on, became more and more openly of an abolitionist. It is easy to argue he was definitely an abolitionist before he was president, but publicly he was not fully in favor of ending slavery. He, in the election of 1860, was just, as I said previously, was only arguing to end the expansion of slavery, even though he personally believed otherwise. As the longer the wars goes on, the more that he recognizes that the key issue of this war is slavery, and the more that he recognizes that it needs to end. I think a good quote from him after he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do signing this paper." He was not someone who was really like a great military leader, and he recognized that, but he was good at picking people to run offices. His cabinet is extremely famous because he picked people who wildly disagreed with each other, but was able to get them all to kind of work together and kind of fight for this common cause of preserving the Union. He was the only president ever elected on a bipartisan ticket, and that was in his re-election in 1864.
Right.
And there's a lot of moving key pieces there. But that would be kind of my brief overview of his time as president. And we can dig into any parts that you wanted to, but there's just so much there. We could probably do a whole series just talking about his presidency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, his is there's so many different facets to it. And, you mentioned, and I was definitely going to throw out that quote about the Emancipation Proclamation. And, he's known as, he's got a lot of nicknames, Honest Abe, we know that, but one of them is the Great Emancipator. Well, he comes in office and he's really not the Great Emancipator. His goal is to dissolve conflict between the North and the South, and to preserve the Union, and basically, reestablish the status quo, get things back to where they were before the slavery debate really inflamed. But as he goes along through the 4 years in office, he kind of recognizes more and more, at least, the evils of slavery, and how it's, of course, devastating to the slaves, and how it's devastating to the country. And so he recognizes, as any smart individual was, and he changes his views as he gets, new information, as he gets smarter. And so, he actually said before he came into office, he said, quote, "If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do that. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would do that too." So, like I said, there's sort of this belief among some people that he comes in and he wants to free the slave. Not really. I mean, that's really not his goal when he comes into office. But he realizes, that eventually it has to be done in order to keep the Union
And
Go.
you know, I
Yeah.
think you said it there, but playing off of that quote, he does the best way to describe it is he basically says, you know, this union will not be able to continue to exist so long as slavery is in existence. And while preserving the union is one of, he would argue, his main reason for pursuing with the war, it is important to note his opposition to slavery does play into that as well. He's using it, the way I would describe it is more of his key point is preserving the union, but if he can get ending slavery out of that, he's going to do it. And I think that's really an important kind of tag on there. And I think that with Lincoln, he I think he hoped that he was going to be able to end it during his presidency. I don't think that, obviously, if he could pick, it would have been a much more peaceful end. But he comes in. I think what's interesting is he comes in. He's not someone who's really set up really well to be a wartime president, if somebody can be. You know, his military experience was not anything noteworthy. He's not someone he's not a great military mind. You know, he's a fairly good politician, but not even like a super notable politician up to that point. But he's someone who, one of my favorite quotes from him is, make sure you're standing in the right place and then stand firm. And he had this kind of stubbornness to him that I would call maybe like a righteous stubbornness. He recognized kind of moral issues in a lot of different areas and was not really willing to budge on them. He would politic his way around them to try to get the outcome that he hoped for, but he wasn't going to move. And as we end, like, you know, when you get to the end of his presidency, and we're seeing the very beginning of Reconstruction, you know, he has things that he thinks are right and just through Reconstruction that he's not willing to budge on, such as like, he believes that Southern states should be allowed to return to the Union without any conditions, but he also believes at the same time that, you know, we have to protect the rights of the freed Black Americans and that those rights cannot be infringed on. And he's unwilling to budge on either of these issues, and they're ones that, honestly, even though he didn't really get to carry that out, would have made things incredibly easier for him. And he was someone who, like, over the course of his presidency, struggled with depression. One of his sons passed away while he was in office. But he struggled with depression, not just because of that and that personal issue, but also because he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. You know, he was ruling a country that was quite literally split in two, and fighting a war against itself. And you know, that's something that would be difficult for any leader. And Lincoln felt very overwhelmed at times. And there's, again, I digress. There's a lot of just moving pieces and aspects to his presidency. And he's someone that the more you learn about him, the more you want to learn about him. But there's almost too much information that we have on him as compared to some of his contemporaries.
Oh yeah, like I said, and I even told you before the episode started, like, majority of this episode is gonna be Abraham Lincoln. I mean, come on, you can't avoid the guy. Like, nothing against, you know, the previous his four predecessors, but I mean, come on, this is the guy who literally helped preserve the Union. So let's tell the story about how that happened. So he, shortly after taking office, as you mentioned earlier, he's met with a letter from Major Robert Anderson, who was the commander of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And he told the president that without a shipment of provisions, he would have to surrender his army to the rebels. And so Lincoln agreed. He sent provisions to Fort Sumter. But on April the 12th of 1861, the first shot is fired at Fort Sumter, beginning the Civil War. So the war begins. And by the way, on orders from Jefferson Davis, of course, the Confederate soldiers fired the first shot. And after this attack, you got 4 border states who joined the Confederacy. So they're gonna put their their stock into this war effort for the Confederates. And you know, despite the fort being surrendered to them, Major Anderson saved the American flag that had flown the island, and it really became a sort of rallying cry for those in the North trying to recruit soldiers for the North to fight in this war against the South, against the Confederates. As it's sort of almost a little bit like how when you had the flag draped over in New York City after 9/11. It sort of became like a rallying cry for those who wanted to preserve the Union. And, as for the Confederate flag, not to get too far off track, but there is sort of this notion, like the Southern pride thing, which has never made sense to me. This was spoken by the founder, or excuse me, the creator of the Confederate flag in 1863, a man named William T. Thompson. He says, "A people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematical of our cause. Upon a red field would stand forth our Southern Cross, gemmed, preserving in beautiful contrast the red, white, and blue." So this is literally a fight between pro-America, anti-America. That's that, or at least the United States of America, I guess would be better put. So the war begins. We see the events, of course, throughout this episode that has led to it. And so Lincoln himself, as you mentioned, his military record is not, at least him serving in the military, it's not like extensive. He's no Dwight D. Eisenhower, for example. But what he does, and this is what I admire about him, he's saying, I'm not just going to ad lib it. I'm going to go. He went to the library in Washington, and he just read and read and read and read about war strategies and things of that nature. And so throughout that year, 1861 and into 1862, he's well-versed on the strategies of war. And so talk about how he really just immersed himself. He is fully committed to preserving the Union in this full war effort.
So, what you said was exactly right, that he studied it himself and studied military strategies, especially ones that would have been taught at like West Point. So that way he could be kind of familiar with what his generals were talking about. At the time, Winfield Scott was the commander of the Union Army. Scott eventually would leave that position, partially because he was just really old, but Lincoln and him got along well. Scott was extremely complimentary of him, and Lincoln made what is considered a pretty brilliant choice in a successor. He kind of scoped the field of Union generals when looking for someone to lead the military for him, and he picked Ulysses S. Grant, who will come up in the next episode. Now, there are a lot of accusations and things that have been thrown out about Grant, but it's undeniable that he was a key part in the success of the Union war effort, and his the choice made by Lincoln to put him in charge of the Union forces was one that, I spoke briefly about Lincoln's cabinet, but just reflects that one thing that Lincoln was really good at was appointing people to offices. He was good at kind of telling the character of people and and kind of motivating them within the positions they were in. And he did that with Grant and Scott. But Grant is probably more notable as the Civil War kind of is prolonged. Lincoln and Grant worked together really well. They had a lot of communications. And I would basically say Lincoln worked to understand the war strategy and to kind of be able to add something to it instead of just kind of sitting in a room with the generals, letting them talk about it and kind of nodding his head. He worked to become someone who could have conversations about that and be able to make decisions from an informed viewpoint.
Yep. And that's what I personally admire about Lincoln, is that he's not just going to go into something and, I talked about ad-libbing and you kind of added to that, but just kind of willy-nilly. He realized how crucially important this was, this whole war effort. And he's able, like you said, to talk with the generals, to be able to, he's a very decisive man. Like he made a decision, he stuck by it. And this is something, we talked about some of his predecessors, at least the ones that lived through the Civil War while Lincoln is in office. They're very critical of some of his positions. And so, but we come through about a little less than a year into the war, and all of a sudden, Lincoln's personal life is rocked by personal tragedy. Early that year, his 11-year-old son, Willie, died of typhoid fever. And this, similar to what we talked about with Franklin Pierce, this just causes absolute devastation with the president, with the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln. And so after Willie's burial, Lincoln, who tried to kind of keep things internal, he was, very private in that regard. Apparently, he went inside a room by himself and wept. I mean, he was absolutely just crushed at Willie's passing. And kind of in a way to properly mourn their son, the Lincolns that summer, and they would do this every summer that Lincoln was in office, they moved from the White House to the Soldiers' Home, which was an asylum for wounded soldiers in Washington. And to their surprise, they kind of found themselves at peace there, because they connected with the wounded soldiers, and it was sort of their way to honor Willie. And so this was really a kind of turning point, because Lincoln, through the tragedy of his own, gets to see the people fighting this war, like it's, connecting with these people that are fighting in the war. And so after this, his workload is just unbelievable. I mean, he's working 18 or so hours a day, 7 days a week. He fully puts himself into this war effort. And so kind of going back to his commitment, talk about the effects of the tragedy with Willie, but also just his, obsessiveness with winning the Civil War.
Lincoln, without a doubt, was in a depression after Willie's death. And that was also driven not just from that great personal loss, but also from the stresses of leading the country through the Civil War. That affected his performance in some ways, but he was able to kind of remain a strong leader through that tragedy. And probably personally for him, this was not great, but he did that by kind of removing himself from the presidency. He kind of viewed Abraham Lincoln and President Lincoln as kind of two separate entities in a way. And that was one of the ways that he just kind of kept going and was able to continue to do his job. And that fed into him kind of pouring himself into his work. It was a distraction from his grief. But even then, the way that he did definitely overworked himself. He had some physical issues because of that. His hands would shake. He would get migraines, things like that. And that was because of his overwork. But it was also that dedication to the office and to the war effort that kind of led to a lot of his successes, not just politically, but also militarily, and being able to kind of keep that strategy going. And because it counted on multiple fronts. He had to keep members of Congress engaged long enough that they would continue to kind of fund and keep up the war effort, and not just kind of give up and let the southern states leave. But he also had to make sure that we were winning the war effort and that we were making moves there. And that was a difficult balance to find.
Yeah, and Lincoln, he's obviously he's struggling with physical issues, mental issues, not to mention that the country is at war with itself. So and we'll get into this a little later, but I cannot even fathom the amount of stress that he was under. He's probably under more stress than any president that's ever served. I mean, the burdens in his life, in his presidency, in this war are just tremendous. And how he kept from absolutely going ballistic is unknown to me. But in April of 1862, which nearly after the Civil War began, General Grant, as you mentioned, General Ulysses Grant had led the Union to a very important victory at the Battle of Shiloh. However, it came at a very terrible cost. 24,000 soldiers were either killed, wounded, or missing during the battle. And it was kind of at this point where Lincoln shifts his mentality and his goal from not just preserving the Union, but also abolishing slavery once and for all. And so July of that year, he proposes, he has a cabinet meeting, and he lays out his Emancipation Proclamation, a bill that would basically abolish slavery in the seceded states and to kind of put an issue to it. And so actually, I'm sorry, they had a cabinet meeting, talking about how we can get a bill ready. And the Emancipation Proclamation is first discussed on September the 22nd of 1862. And kind of the criticism by some who were opposed to it, some worried if this was even constitutional. As a matter of fact, it probably wasn't constitutional. But talk about just the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, which became law on New Year's Day the following year.
So Lincoln did care about whether it was constitutional or not, so I don't want him to seem careless there. But he kind of said to the members of his cabinet, whether this is constitutional or not, it's morally right, and I need to do it. And he was able to kind of get all of them on board enough to go along with it without causing a fuss. So actually, Tennessee was actually exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the only state that seceded that was exempt from it. And I believe that it had been reclaimed by the time he signed it. But he signed the Emancipation Proclamation with the intent of basically, so as Union troops were retaking territory in the South, they would free the slaves as they went. And the idea was to basically cauterize that in law, so that not only should they continue to do that, but they would be required to do that. So at this point, Tennessee had been retaken, and the reason why it was exempt from it was because of a deal with, after his reelection, future Vice President Andrew Johnson. But but in the other states, it assured that the slaves would be freed, and that basically the South would not only lose militarily, but they would lose ideologically. That regardless of, basically, and this was an issue for the South in their war effort, if you lose the territory and the slaves are freed, if you retake that territory, you have already lost. And that was an issue for them. Because if you're fighting to preserve slavery, which was their main issue, their main point in having the war, and all your slaves are freed, you've lost. So that was part of Lincoln's strategy there. So it was a way to abolish slavery, or at least the start of that effort for him, while kind of avoiding the political debate that it would still have in the North, and while contributing to the war effort. So it was a brilliant piece of strategy, and it was something that Lincoln kind of personally took a lot of great pride in, because to him, he viewed it as like the first nail in the coffin of slavery. And it was something that he was proud to kind of be the father of.
That's a good point. That your last point, like he was very proud of it. He was, it really, above all, it's probably, obviously, we know what happens with the Civil War after this, but the Emancipation Proclamation, I think at least, is his greatest legacy. It's really what lifts him to that pantheon, that those 4, 5, 6 guys that we consider the greatest presidents in American history. And as somebody who changed the office, who changed the country with this piece of legislation, the bad news is it didn't really do anything at all to stop the war. And so the war continues, and by July of 1863, Robert E. Lee's army, Confederate Army, is marching towards a little farm town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Now, many thought that this would be sort of the battle of battles, the one that would end the war, in a sense. This did not happen, of course, and in reality, it was just nothing short of just complete devastation. 3 days of bloodshed ensued, and disturbing photos were taken of men lying dead on the battlefield, and this furthered Lincoln's depression, and it really exposed the country to the horrors and the devastation of war. And so these photographs are taken, and in November of that year, probably one of the most iconic speeches in American history was given. Lincoln travels to Gettysburg to commemorate a new cemetery honoring those who lost their lives in the Battle of Gettysburg, and he delivers what we know as the Gettysburg Address. Now, we don't have time to fully read it. It's a short speech. It's about 2-3 minutes long. But what he says in the speech is, this is not it. Like, this is not the end of our fight to win this war. And just talk about the speech, the significance of it, why it's still regarded the way it is as one of the greatest speeches in American history, and what message Lincoln was trying to convey in it.
One thing I do want to note real quick, and it is ironic. Lincoln actually in his speech predicted that it would not be remembered. He said the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, which is ironic because it's considered one of the greatest speeches, if not the greatest speech ever given by an American president.
Yep.
But he basically in that speech, for the first time, publicly said, the way when this war ends, we will end slavery. And he kind of publicly says that, and he says it in this speech, and it's not very long, but he basically says, that the war is not over. We're going to win this fight. We are fighting for the ideals of our founders, which is something that the Confederates were claiming. So he was kind of retaking that, saying we are the ones fighting for the ideals of the founders. We are not going to give up. This war will end. We will live. And he says, we were conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he says in one other quote, he says, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And by making that point, he's making it clear that the Confederacy is neither of those things.
Right.
So he's recognizing that they are not giving those rights to all men. And he is recognizing that by excluding those people from democracy, excluding people of a certain race from democracy, it is no longer a democracy. And Lincoln saying those things were extremely bold. But it was something that I think he was ready to say, but also I think the American people were beginning to be ready to hear. And I think that those bold statements, this kind of optimistic message of this speech at a time that was not optimistic at all, that people were looking and believing that it might be the end. It's something that has really stuck around just in the American ethos because it was something that was so necessary. And Lincoln thought that the speech was a failure after he gave it, but obviously it was one that helped kind of give energy to the Northerners to preserve the war effort and spoke to the larger principles of America and what America and how America was going to live up to those principles after the war. And it took them a while to get there, but he kind of put forth a vision for how America was going to continue with those founding principles at the end of this war, and was defining them in opposition to the Confederacy. And it is, I would encourage all the listeners to go and read the speech. The Gettysburg Address is, I'm not sure I really have all the words that I want to describe it with. It is just without a doubt one of the greatest speeches in the history of the presidency.
100%. And there's actually in this attraction, because people out there know I'm a huge Disney parks nerd. They actually have this thing called the Hall of Presidents. They've got every single president that's ever saved. They've got their own animatronic up there, and there's a point in the middle where they have the animatronic of Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address, and it is a moving speech. And he talks about 77 years ago. That's 87 years at the time of the speech. Our fathers founded on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He is, like you said, he's reaffirming not just the goals of the war, but the goals of America. The goal that what the founding fathers wanted to sort of experiment with. Like, can a democracy survive something as horrible as a civil war? And that's really what he's trying to do in the speech. And I did not know that he thought that the speech was a failure. I don't know why he would have thought that, but hey, listen, it was, like you said, it was one of the greatest speeches, if not the greatest speech ever delivered by an American president. And it really reinvigorated the North to keep fighting, to keep going, not to give up, not to surrender to the South. And hey, maybe slavery, not slavery, but just the country is preserved in part just because of this little 3-minute speech. And so it's crucially important. And I'm in lockstep with you, Isaac, and to all the listeners out there. Please go read the speech or listen to the Hall of Presidents excerpt. It's amazing. And so now we come to a point in 1864. Abraham Lincoln's running for a re-election. And contrary to what people might think, his re-election was not a sure thing whatsoever. And so talk about how, I mean, people are not so sure. Heck, Lincoln, because before I give you the opportunity to comment on, let me just kind of give the backstory of why it was sort of in flux in a way. Lincoln is saying, or at least the man Lincoln is running against is one of his former generals who he had fired, a man named George B. McClellan. And McClellan's saying, if I win, I'll end the Civil War. Like that was his big campaign promise. And Lincoln, on the other hand, is like, we're not ready to end it yet. And people are thinking, heck, Lincoln even thought that this was going to be the end of him. And he actually wrote a pledge that was signed by his cabinet that read, quote, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to do so, cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." So he is saying, if I win, if I lose, I'll cooperate with the president-elect, but it's a level of stubbornness in a way that you brought up earlier, that he's holding to this. We're not ready to end this war. And so talk about the probabilities of re-election for Lincoln are not so great, at least in the early to mid part of 1864.
So, like with any war, the American public was kind of tired of it, especially with a war that's, fought on home turf. You don't want to have to go through it. So with an opponent that's basically saying, like, I'll just end it, that was appealing to a lot of people who were just tired of the fighting. Lincoln also had what was a smart but also controversial choice. He actually ran for re-election on a ticket that was known as the National Union Party. So the National Union Party was their ticket was, the Republican Party did not run anyone. They deferred to that ticket. The National Union Party was basically a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans who are basically saying we are in favor of preserving the Union. So his Vice President Hannibal Hamlin did not run for re-election with him. He instead nominated Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat senator from Tennessee. Even though Tennessee had seceded from the Union, Johnson did not, and he was the only Southern member of Congress to continue to serve in Congress after the war had started. And when Tennessee, being the first state recaptured, Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee. And we'll discuss that in the next episode. But Lincoln runs on this bipartisan ticket, which is in some ways strategic and helps take some votes away from the Democratic ticket, but also is controversial because not everybody likes Andrew Johnson, and the idea of having a bipartisan ticket is something that even during this time in the war, not everybody's cool with. But Lincoln, was facing a lot of accusations and claims. He was being accused of being a warmonger. He was being accused of not caring about the Constitution and overextending the executive, which even he admitted he might have been, like he probably was. But he was kind of saying, for us to even continue to have the Constitution, for us to be able to debate the powers of the presidency, we have to have a country to do that in. And his argument was basically not this could sound overly self-righteous, and I don't think Lincoln was. I think Lincoln was actually very humble, but he was basically saying I know that I'm not going to take this too far. I know that I can rein myself in, so I would rather me abuse the powers of the presidency and preserve the Union, and then that never happen again, than me not do it and thus lose the Union, and then there's no Union.
The Constitution,
there's nowhere to debate it. Yeah. But those weren't, that's not That's not a popular position to take. And it's a risky one. It's a risky one for the American public to reelect a president saying that, even at a time of national crisis. But Lincoln ultimately convinces the American public that continuing the war is necessary. And he does. And in his second term, or we can talk, would you want to discuss his second inaugural address at all?
No, I mean, we can. I'll get into that, but I just want to say, of course, as you point out, he did win due to some very critical Union victories during the Civil War in 1864. So he carried all but 3 states, winning re-election. And so talk about, yeah, absolutely. Go into March 4th, 1865. It's his inauguration, his second inauguration. And yeah, just discuss like what he said and how he sort of, in a way, I guess, labeled some form of not necessarily reconstruction, but certainly how we're going to move forward in coming close, because the war is starting to come to a close at this point. How we're going to try and end this thing and move forward as a nation.
So he basically speaks in it. He has a message of kind of like, like we're all praying and hoping that this war ends soon. It's a really beautiful speech. His second inaugural address, I would also encourage the audience to go and read that one. It's also up there and again, probably top 5 best presidential speeches. But he basically just kind of reaffirms like we are going to end this, and we're going to stand firm, and we're going to win. And it's again it's not a speech people were expecting. People were expecting it to be softer. But he went in and it was he was very clear in his intentions. He was clear, like, we're going to end the war. We're going to have reconstruction. Their union is going to become whole again. And people weren't really ready for it. The crowd was kind of like a little taken aback. But it was one that even at the time people recognized as being a great speech. He as we move in, you mentioned reconstruction, and he does talk about his plans for the union afterwards in that speech, but I'll go ahead and move a little bit to plans for reconstruction. Lincoln believed that the southern states should be allowed back into the union without having to pay penalties, which was extremely controversial. That was not a popular view to hold, but he really stuck to that. He also believed that we had to amend the Constitution to guarantee the rights of Black Americans, and there were it was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Is that right, or is the 14th, 15th, and 16th?
I think it was 15. I think while you're going, I'll check and make sure.
But basically, he was able to get the constitutional amendments passed. One made slavery and indentured servitude unconstitutional, except in the case of like imprisonment.
It was the 15th, by the way.
That was the 15th.
Yes.
Then we also have an amendment guaranteeing the right to vote to Black men. And then we have one that is guaranteeing, or supposed to guarantee, civil rights and citizenship.
Right.
And obviously, again, in later episodes, we'll get into whether those amendments were followed through or not. But they all are amended to the Constitution. And it's put into the Reconstruction Plan that it's required for all Southern states when they rejoin to ratify these constitutional amendments. You can go ahead.
No, go ahead.
He also makes a move that will be continued by his successors to clear all like your average Confederate soldier of any and all crimes. He believes that if we're going to let them back into the Union, we have to kind of end these divisions, and we have to kind of welcome them back, which is also not a popular viewpoint at all. People wanted kind of to get not revenge, but they wanted to give the
some sort of punishment.
Yes. And Lincoln basically said, like, we can't do that. If we do that, then the divisions are just going to linger longer than they need to. And people have debated whether that was the right decision or not. But I think that it says something about Lincoln wanted the Union to be restored, and he recognized that it wasn't going to be restored if we continued to punish the Confederate states decades after they rejoined the Union.
Yeah, and in Lincoln's own words in describing that, he promised, quote, malice towards none and charity to all. And so he's very much for, we're going to end this war. South's going to come into the Union or back into the Union. There's not going to be any sort of punishment. And it's very interesting how that carries out. And we'll see that, like you mentioned, in episode 4. But this is not an overly popular move, as many decisions Lincoln made were not popular at that time. But yeah, I mean, it is debated. Should they have been punished? Should the soldiers have been punished? We can debate that all day. But 36 days later, we come to April 9th of 1865, and Robert E. Lee surrenders his Confederate army to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, and so the Civil War is almost over. So 2 days later, Lincoln gave a speech where he, for the very first time, he publicly talked about giving the black man the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And so if you have any, as well as bringing the South back in the Union, like his inaugural address, and so talk about, if you could, sort of what he talked about in this speech and wanting to guarantee the same civil rights and civil liberties to black Americans as was guaranteed to white Americans.
So in the same way that Lincoln recognized that kind of former Confederates had to be forgiven for those divisions to kind of go away after the war, he also recognized that the rights of black Americans had to also be protected, that if we allowed those rights to be trampled upon, that basically the divisions that led to the war would linger. And, that's ultimately a prediction that was correct. But he made moves and viewed it as an issue of great importance to protect those rights, to not only free them, but to give them citizenship and to give them access to the founders' promise. And that was an issue that throughout his presidency, he was moved on. He probably, we know this, earlier on in his presidency, he was in favor of establishing colonies to move the freed blacks out of what would have been the continental United States, and either to there were some islands in the Caribbean, or to back to the continent of Africa. And while that was like a fairly popular view at the time, because it was kind of viewed as like a compromise, like kind of ensuring their freedom, was kind of the idea a little bit, and there were some other things there. But Lincoln was kind of showing that he now viewed, and this was part of his experience during the war and interacting more and more with freed black men, was basically that they were going to become an integral part of American society, and that they needed to be able to be given the path where that could happen. And I think that that's really important when talking about Lincoln, is kind of his progression in his views on like the issue of slavery and the issue of race. He really, the more that he had to interact with it and interact with the people who had been impacted by it, the more he realized that the only path forward is going to be a path of freedom and a path of equality. And it was something that did become pretty personally important to him, especially at the end of his life.
Exactly. And yeah, of course, he makes a speech, and ensuring the rights and liberties for black Americans was very important to him toward the end of his presidency and the end of his life, ultimately. And so what happens is we get to April the 14th, 3 days later. And he and his wife, Mary Todd, they go to Ford's Theater, which was Good Friday, by the way, at that time. They went to see the play Our American Cousin. While watching the play, Mary Todd asked her husband, she asked him, where is this? Oh, yeah. What will Miss Harris think on my hanging to you so? The president replied, she won't think anything about it. They had went with some other people to this play, and they were sitting, of course, in one of the boxes. And at the same time, an actor named John Wilkes Booth walks into the theater at about 10 after 10 o'clock at this time in Washington. 5 minutes later, as the president was laughing at a joke in the play, or allegedly laughing at a joke in the play, Booth fired one shot at point blank range to the back of Lincoln's head and escaped the theater. There was, and we'll get into this at least at the beginning of episode 4, but there was kind of a conspiracy to go after the president, the vice president, General Grant, and pretty much everybody, the Secretary of State, go after everybody who has fought to preserve the Union and defeat the Confederacy. And John Wilkes Booth was a big part of this. And so throughout the night, I talk about the conspirators, and thankfully, William Seward, his Secretary of State, he was stabbed, but thankfully he survived his injuries. And 9 hours later, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. He became the first president in American history to be assassinated. And talk about the reception of the country and just the outpouring of grief at what was just such a sudden tragedy.
It was one of great sadness. Lincoln almost immediately was kind of viewed as a martyr, not just for the Union, but also for like civil rights and the end of slavery, and kind of taking upon that issue kind of became a preservation of his legacy. You know, the nation was in mourning. They went on a weeks-long tour of his coffin, and thousands upon thousands of Americans poured out in every city where they stopped to pay their respects to the president. His importance historically and just to the culture and to the government of the United States was even clearer at that point. People understood how important he was. And even though he was not the most popular president while he was serving in office, Americans of all different walks of life mourned his loss and recognized the importance of the loss of leadership. The idea that a president was assassinated was kind of horrific, on top of America coming out of this war and dealing with all these new issues. That was something that really was off-putting to a lot of people and was concerning. And it showed that the divides between North and South were not gone yet. You know, Lincoln's legacy became one, like I said, of preserving the Union and ending slavery. He was kind of codified as the great emancipator, and you know, I think that's a legacy he would have been happy to have had. I think kind of where I would like to kind of end talking about his life, but it would be just a quick reflection on his wife's life. Mary Todd Lincoln had gone through the death of multiple children. She had one other child who actually died after Lincoln's death. She was a woman who had struggled with depression for a lot of her life. You know, she never recovered, especially from Lincoln's death. She went on. She would hire spiritualists to hold seances to try to contact her children or Lincoln from beyond the grave. She was desperate. She became addicted to several kinds of medication, and even at one point went to a pharmacist to try to get medication to overdose. And she wound up becoming institutionalized after that incident. And she was just this woman who became totally lost. And I feel like in some ways, kind of the way that Mary Todd's life kind of devolved after Lincoln's assassination is how a lot of people kind of felt. Just this utter loss. And I think that that's kind of where I would leave the Lincoln episode. There was a lot of his presidency could arguably even be the most eventful of any of them, or it's at least up there. And he was someone who came into office hoping to kind of quietly preserve the Union, and left the office as the president who had led the nation through a civil war, the deadliest war still today in American history. He had become the great emancipator, and he was killed. And that's where I would leave it.
Yeah, and he was. You make a good point that's his legacy today. I think he would be thrilled about it, especially when you see, and of course we'll get into this in future episodes, but there were certainly setbacks, many in regards to and fighting for full freedom for Black people, for Black Americans. But as far as how Lincoln is viewed, heck, when he passed, and even to this day, I think he would be thrilled at how he's remembered. I think he would at least maybe looking at it as somewhat of a success. Yes, thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in this war, and that would, of course, we know the depression that cost him. But appreciate you telling, kind of Mary Todd's story and how she struggled afterwards. But I mean, that's honestly that's a good way to kind of leave it. Is Lincoln kind of transcended, as I talked about, he kind of transcended the presidency. He's almost he's almost sort of historically almost risen above it in some ways, because his goal from the start of the war till his death was to preserve the Union. Eventually that evolves into preserve the Union and free slaves. And that is certainly something to be admired. And I'm not that sure how many presidents, if any, in our history could have dealt with the stress and the burden and the responsibility that Lincoln did. We've had many presidents who have dealt before and after, who have dealt with crises, obviously. But this was the greatest crisis that the country could have ever experienced. And he led us through it to his credit. So, yeah, I mean, if you have any last thoughts, feel free, my man.
I think just one last notable thing that I've thought of. Another important thing that he did was he helped reclaim the founding ideals. And he helped put a new emphasis on all men are created equal, which is an emphasis that I think is one that almost every American would make today. That when you go over life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that those all lie on that ideal that all men are created equal. And that's one that has become a driving ideal of America. And I think that new put emphasis on the founder's vision comes from Abraham Lincoln. And I think that America, I think it's, even though America had kind of gone through hell during his presidency, I think ultimately he left the presidency, he left America better than he found it.
That's it.
And I think that's kind of where it ends.
That's right. That's how I'm going to, once we get to the end of the series, that's kind of how I'm going to rank my presidents. Wherever's the country at when they take over, where's it at when they leave? And safe to say that he did a pretty darn good job in that regard. So certainly a somber ending to this episode 3 of Carving It Up, President's Edition. But certainly this is a chapter in American history, man, that is tough, that is still talked about to this day. And the significance of each man, obviously chief among them, Lincoln, who served, I mean, that it helped shape America to where it continued through Reconstruction, which we'll talk about extensively in the next episode. And today, we see some of the good and bad that has happened. So any final thoughts, Isaac, on just sort of what we talked about and what we're going to go into in the following episode, starting with Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson?
I would just say, like I said at the very beginning of the episode, this era we're seeing America's kind of having to make its decision on slavery. And as we leave this era, we're going to see America kind of struggle with what that means. And that's kind of where we're going next, is how, now that it's made the decision, or is it ready to address what that looks like? And that's where they're going to struggle with next. And that's where we're going to see the new issues arise.
It's well said. All right, Isaac, I appreciate you coming on for this episode 3. I look forward to talking to you in episode 4, man.
Thank you again. I'm looking forward to it.
That was Isaac Lawson joining the Carving It Up U.S. President's Edition, episode 3. That was, yeah, I mean, that's, there's no other way to really put it except that this era was filled with hardships, with tragedy, with those who were fighting for America, those who were fighting against America, those who were fighting for the rights of Black people, those who were not. And so this is, like I said, even to this day, it's really one of the most debated points of American history. And I think when you look at Lincoln's predecessors and their failures and how Lincoln comes in and transforms the office. He transforms the country by, as Isaac said, relying on the principles of the founding fathers, as well as putting, of course, his ideas into it. I think just enhances his legacy. And like I said, I'll throw this out there, and I said this summer when I did my list of 5 people, dead or alive, that I would invite to my house for dinner. Abraham Lincoln's on that list without a question. I said it last summer, and I absolutely stick by it today. So I enjoyed talking about him. I enjoyed talking about maybe not as much, but the other presidents in this episode. So until next time, appreciate everybody watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, Anchor, as well as wherever you get your podcast. Until episode 4, I'm Bryson Carver. Hope you'll have a great day, rest of your week until our next episode. Stay safe out there. God bless you all.